Okay, a couple of very brief announcements. A couple of you have come to see me in my office hours, which was delightful, and the rest of you must come. And one of the issues that came up was about the textbook and about the readings. So I thought I should say something to clarify that. You should by now have understood that the textbook is a very different type of beast to the lectures that I give, which is to say that you very rarely hear me talk about a monarch, or a prime minister, or the development or fall of a particular government. And the textbook is basically primarily structured by the fortune and monarchs. It also has a nice twist, I think, on a story of the sort of genius of the British aristocracy and the way in which the empire just happens almost by accident, and they just keep on getting more of it because they've got some, so why give up? So clearly the arguments that I'm trying to give you are different to the textbook, and I want you to use that in a productive way, i.e. not to accept everything that either I or the textbook says as for granted. The other thing on readings was the online readings. It has been the case that I've had so much to say that I haven't really given you any chance at all to talk about the readings in lecture. But it's also the case that some of the readings don't come up directly in the lectures. Some do, but some don't. And I just have to reassure you to have faith that the reading that you're doing is not wasted reading. They will come up in some form or other. I'll give you a good example. So today there was reading from Engels, and I'm going to only very briefly gesture to it. But when I talk about urbanisation in the late 19th century, that will be a picture that I'll talk about a fair amount. Okay, so on Tuesday we looked at this liberal revolution in government that I suggested laid the basis for a new type of modern bureaucratic state, able to govern over people that you didn't know, able to govern strangers. And I also tried to suggest that this type of liberal government was haunted by a paradox of having to govern people in order to make them free, and trying to produce a new type of person that I called a sort of ideal liberal person or an ideal liberal subject. Now, one solution to that paradox I suggested was the creation of this new domain, this thing called the social or society, in which you could just dump all the problematic people in and say, okay, their social problems, we'll sort it out, it's utterly different to economic or to political life. So I talked a fair amount about the identification of specifically problematic groups of people like the poor and the insanitary. Today, I'm going to continue to look at this, what we could almost call a liberal revolution, by talking about the emergence of liberal political economy. And remember, one of the themes of Tuesday's lecture was this idea that government could be conducted scientifically. And today we're also going to see the emergence of political economy and eventually economics as a science, and the way in which that underpins a new set of beliefs and preoccupation. I'm also going to be telling you today, suggesting to you today, that two other similarities with the lecture on Tuesday. The first is the identification of the economy itself as something separate. So I talked about the social domain on Tuesday. Now I'm going to talk about a new type of economic domain. The idea of the economy, even as a nationally bounded thing, emerges in this time, and I'll try and explain what I mean by that when we get there. And I'm also going to be suggesting that the new liberal political economy that emerges in the middle of the 19th century also aims, just as the liberal revolution in government, to produce a new type of person, is engaged in the production of a new sort of individual, a new type of liberal individual. So, what was this liberal political economy? I'm going to suggest to you that it has three central components: a belief in cheap government, a belief in free trade, and the creation of the gold standard. These ideas became absolutely dominant in the 19th century. They became so dominant that, in effect, they lasted in Britain down to the 1930s. But it was in the 1840s and 50s that this new set of beliefs came to become intellectually dominant. And they were, of course, many of them ideas that had been developed by Smith in the late 18th century. And it's also worth noticing here that a key part in the construction of this new system was the eradication of the old remnants of the mercantile system that Smith was so animated by, namely the Corn Laws and the Navigation Acts, both of which are finally repealed in the 1840s. Finally, I'm going to be saying to you that you can see very clearly the ideas behind this liberal political economy in two great episodes that I'm going to focus on as particular case studies. The first is the famine in Ireland in the late 40s, and the second is the occasion of the Great Exhibition, which was the world's first trade fair in 1851. So if this system is put in place in the 1840s, by 1885, you have Walter Bagehot, the editor of The Economist, from the 1860s, writing that, I'll let you read this, but the punchline is basically at the bottom, saying, look, Smith's ideas have become so profoundly influential in Britain that they have settled to become the common sense of the nation. And people consider these ideas now as the natural way of ordering economic life. And this is published in the 1880s. Liberal political economy, Bagehot has said, has become a self-evident truth, which seems to be beyond question. So the question I'm going to be asking in today's lecture is basically, how did that happen? How did this new series of beliefs become a natural part of the order of things and become beyond question? And I think that's a particularly interesting question in the British context, not because Britain became the world's largest empire on the back of this new system, but because it was a system that profoundly ruined the lives of a good many people, both in Britain but especially across the empire. So despite the carnage that was wrought by this new system, it remained effectively beyond question. Not that there weren't critics or alternative voices that I'll try and point to as we go along. So first, let me turn to what I'm calling the gospel of free trade. Remember, I'm trying to suggest to you that there are these three key components of liberal political economy as it consolidates itself in the 19th century. Cheap government, the gold standard, and free trade. And free trade is symbolically the most important of them all, and politically the most contentious of them all. So we think, obviously, of economics as a science, as a scientific discipline that can explain and indeed enable us to produce economic growth. That's what economists do. Economics emerged out of this field of debate and discussion known as political economy. And political economy was a product of the very Enlightenment that we talked about last week or the week before. The idea that empirical observation could make legible the rhythms or laws of economic life. And once you had empirically observed them, once you had established these patterns or regularities, then you could make certain experiments or produce certain types of interventions to improve economic life. Okay, so political economy in that sense was a classic example of Enlightenment thought. And yet, as with much Enlightenment thought, it remained deeply influenced by religious currents and ideas. Okay, so political economy, I'm going to suggest, was structured by a highly moralized view of the world that took much of its basis from religion and from the influence of evangelical thought, particularly. So let's take as examples of this Adam Smith and Thomas Malthus. In many ways, they occupied the opposite ends of political economy. And Smith was a great believer in commerce and the freedom of trade. Malthus was much closer to the old mercantilist position, worried about land and the finite resources of land and the pressures on population. Okay? Smith was a great optimist who thought that men were driven by their pursuit of wealth, by their desire for wealth. Malthus was a great pessimist that thought they had to starve before they got industrious. Both basically produced a political economy that had a strong component of belief in some type of divine action or intervention, in providence, broadly described. Smith thought that the distributive mechanisms of the market, the distribution of wealth, was left to what he called the invisible hand. Malthus thought that laws of population were going to be structured by man's battle against his sinful lust, always a battle not worth fighting, and that acts of providence, like plagues or famines, would check those would check the growth of populations. So there you have two key figures, both of whom basically turn to providence at key points in their explanation of their political economy. But liberal political economy was also a deeply moralized view of the world and of market relations. So two figures that you'll hear a lot about today, because they're leaders of the anti-corn law movement, major advocates of free trade, John Bright and Richard Cobden, both believed, for instance, that free trade would bring peace and prosperity to the world. For them, free trade was less an economic doctrine than a ethos, a politics, a set of morals that could transform the world. Indeed, both of them were profoundly critical of imperialism because they thought that free trade would do the civilizing work that governments do and shouldn't do. You just leave it to the passage of trade and people will be civilized without the intervention of colonial states. In addition, Victorians basically believed that the distributive logic of the market reflected the moral character of those who were rich. You were rich because you were deserving, you were of good moral character, you were industrious, you were diligent, etc., etc. And for the poor, you suffered poverty because you had a flawed moral character. A leading historian of this moment, a man called Boyd Hilton, has described this as the Age of Atonement and has shown the way in which political economy is intricately connected to these patterns of evangelical thought. Bankruptcy, for instance, was a huge moral stain on one's character if one went bankrupt. And it was seen very often as a punishment for past sinful actions. So I'm suggesting to you that political economy doesn't displace religion. It was enmeshed and in many ways authorized by it. And that combination helped naturalize the idea that the market should be left to its natural state of freedom. But it also legitimated the distribution of wealth within it. It was all part, in many ways, of God's divine plan. And really, that influence of religion on political economy doesn't begin to recede until the second half of the 19th century, and particularly when economics begins to develop from the 1870s onwards and turns to first historical approaches and then increasingly quantitative forms of analysis and explanation. Not quite sure why we've gone back to there, but let's move on. Here you have, very excitingly, The Economist, as was in 1843 when it first started. So even though I'm suggesting that liberal political economy was enmeshed with religion in this way, it did carve out a new understanding of the economy as its own thing, as its own entity, its own domain, that had its own laws and patterns that could be discovered and observed and that. And in many ways, The Economist provides me with a great way of explaining this. As I said, it's founded in 1843. It's founded, interestingly, as one of the journals of the Anti-Corn Law League, and it has an absolutely tiny circulation of under 5,000 people. But it becomes massively influential very quickly, and it does something that no one had done beforehand. It observed and recorded and analysed economic life in its totality. So this wasn't a trade journal focused upon the textiles industries or an engineering journal focusing upon engineering or the London Times financial things. This was a magazine that analysed and recorded all forms of economic activity and began to put together ways of understanding them as being part of a system, as being connected in some way. It's The Economist that begins the detailed statistical analysis of market prices and trends. Under the editorship of Walter Bagehot in the 1860s, they begin to identify to publish price indices and map the percentage change in the volume of trade and identify trade cycles for the first time by the 1880s. In many ways, The Economist is doing things that enables the discipline of economics to emerge, bearing in mind that economic statistics are at their absolute infancy at this time. It's not until the 1890s that economics gets its own professional organisation. The Royal Economic Society is formed in 1890. Economists begin to get their own journals in the 1880s and 1890s. Now, this idea of the economy as its own domain, its own entity, was not just about new ways that people thought. It was also about new things that the state did to make the economy and the idea of the market as a unified place of exchange happen. Okay? So the very idea of a national economy, the very idea of a free market I'm suggesting, is the result of state action. I'm going to give you two examples of here, which I've touched on briefly in another lecture, which is weights and measures and money. Okay? Both of these things are critical to carve out across the nation the idea that you could have a uniform form of exchange. That whether you were in Aberdeen or whether you were in Exeter, you would be dealing with the same weights, you would be trading things for the same weights and measures, that a pound of flour in Exeter weighed the same amount as a pound of flour in Aberdeen, and that you were going to be paying with it in a currency that was true of both places, in both places. Imperial weights and measures come in 1824. By 1878, the Board of Trade has the sole jurisdiction over weights and measures and coins, and its inspectors, because of course they get inspectors, their inspectors are empowered to go into any premise where anything is being bought and sold to check the scales, that they're not being sold under false weights, to protect fraud in the marketplace. And the imperial weights and measures was meant to be an imperial system. It was meant to be a system that would stretch across the empire and facilitate transcolonial trade, and that became especially important in the 1860s onwards when the French led the push to the new metric system, and some countries like Britain and America remained loyal to the old imperial system. And a large part of that reason was not because Americans and Brits can't count in hundreds, it's because of the degree of trade that occurred already on that old system of imperial weights and measures. Money. And key here is the development not so much of uniform coins and notes, although that is important, but also the creation of the gold standard. The connection that all notes and coins that were issued corresponded to holdings of gold bullion by the Bank of England. Okay? Notes and coins were now no longer had their intrinsic value in them. A note wasn't literally worth a pound of gold, but that pound was held in the Bank of England. In 1812, tradesmen's tokens that had been so important in the 17th and 18th century were finally abolished. It was illegal to use tradesmen's tokens. By 1821, after a series of committees, the so-called Bullion Committee, of which Sir Robert Peel was a leading figure, Britain finally built up its bullion deposits after the Napoleonic Wars to go fully on the gold standard, even though actually the Bank of England kept a hold of silver as well until quite late, until the 1850s and 1860s. But Britain projected itself as being out on the gold standard. And a series of bank acts, most importantly in 1833 and 1844, limited the numbers of banks that could issue notes and coins in order to tighten the fiscal control around the Bank of England and its holdings of gold. Critical here, and I don't have time to go into this, meant that Britain's currency became an international currency, and that Britain's colonies, their currencies were locked in a subordinate position to the pound sterling. Classically, the great example is the rupee in India, which is put on the silver standard at great cost to the Indian economy, and it remains on the silver standard until the 1890s. At great cost, because the price of silver absolutely plummets in the later 19th century. So I don't have time to go into that. Now, establishing the gold standard after the Napoleonic Wars required a new type of fiscal discipline. It required what our governments now call austerity measures. I talked about how important the idea of the national debt was to the creation of a new imperial state after the Glorious Revolution. Now, in the 19th century, the national debt becomes conceived as a bad thing. Government shouldn't be that expensive, and it shouldn't, just as an individual shouldn't be in debt or go bankrupt, neither, God forbid, should a state run its finances in that way. So a whole series of new austerity measures are introduced to tighten the supply of money in the years immediately after the Napoleonic Wars. And that leads to, amongst other things, massive unemployment. But it does produce this very dramatic transformation. So here we have the scale of the national debt in Britain at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. I can't really use my neck, so here, to do this with a cursor, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, massive public debt. By 1900, by the end of the 19th century, you can see this new understanding and practice of cheap government had really taken hold. But cheaper government didn't mean, as you should have got from Tuesday, either less active government or indeed what politicians sometimes now refer to as small government. And this is particularly true in the realm of the economy. So it was going to be absolutely impossible to create this new economic system without active intervention and abolition of key forms of obstacles to the natural flow of the economy. And really, you can think of the three central pillars of that old mercantile system being slavery, the Corn Laws, and the Navigation Acts. And between 1833, the abolition of slavery, 1846, the abolition of the Corn Laws, Navigation Acts abolished in 1849. The last real component of that old mercantile system was the East India Company, which is abolished in 1857, 1858 after the revolt in India and the assumption of direct colonial rule from London. Even the East India Company had had a whole series of its monopolies taken away long before. So in 1813, its monopoly of trade in India had been removed. In 1833, its monopoly of trade in China was removed. So